The last time I chatted with Pastor Adam Kuntz, we went on a tangent into something he'd said in a previous episode about the Benedict option. And if you haven't heard that episode about the Benedict option and how it is thoroughly unbiblical, because it's about appeasement, right? You go check that out. I'll put a link in the show notes about that episode. We're going to get back into Ezekiel this time now. And it's been a while. I mean, I'm not even sure where we left off. It certainly, yeah, right. It certainly was around verse 15 of chapter 3, but since we're not going line by line through the book, yeah, I don't know if that's exactly the most important thing to know. So then Pastor Kuntz and I were chatting just a moment before we started recording, and I said, well, I got these notes. And so I read the first thing in the notes. He's like, that was a long time ago. Whoa. Yeah. But let's talk about it. So we're just going to start there. With some context of Ezekiel 3 maybe thrown into the mix, let's dig into the religion of the law and the religion of the gospel and how this is a thoroughly biblical idea. What do you think?
Yeah, so law and gospel will be familiar to most listeners as the way that we understand how God is speaking to us, the law being God's demand upon our lives, broadly conceived, and the gospel being God's gift in Jesus Christ for life and eternal life. That distinction has a lot more in it because it is a scriptural distinction. And whenever you're dealing with something that is actually biblical, you will find depths within the scriptures on those things that you didn't anticipate before. So if you're interested in this, a great place to start scripturally on law and gospel would be 2 Corinthians 3 and 4, where Paul explains these things a little more clearly, and that'll get you into some biblical texts that are helpful. When we're talking about the term religion of the law or religion of the gospel, we're talking about something that is brought up a little more broadly in our theology as a way of thinking about what's the difference between Christianity and every other religion. So just to deal with a misconception first, a lot of people think of the Old Testament as law and the New Testament as gospel, whereas the Old Testament, in fact, has many beautiful promises concerning Christ and God's gifts for us. And the New Testament also has demands upon our lives. Ezekiel lines up somewhat neatly. Maybe Ezekiel was kind of an average Lutheran pastor in this way, in that, roughly speaking, the first part of the book is mostly God's demands on the life of Israel. And the last part of the book, especially chapters 40 to 48, are about God's gifts to Israel in the vision of the new temple and the renovation of the world. So all of that is to say that when you're dealing with anything in the Bible, law and gospel is not something that you have to push down on the Bible. The Bible will show it to you, which is why just knowing the distinction in your mind, the confessions call a particularly bright light. When we're talking about Ezekiel 3, the religion of the law would be a religion that would have judgment on Israel, but no promises. And a misconception I think that a lot of people have about Old Testament prophets is that they are there to proclaim gloom and doom or fire and brimstone. And they are there to do that. But the point is even bigger. And I think you see that in Ezekiel 3, which is that Ezekiel's role is to warn the wicked from his way. If you don't warn him when he's actually in danger, then the fact that you didn't preach the law to him is on your head, God says. But if you proclaim the law and he simply doesn't listen, that's on his head. Now, the way that this lines up with talking about different religions is that Christianity uniquely is a religion of law and gospel. Whereas every other religion, and academically, I have been living during graduate school within a religion department where, I work on what they call early Christianity, right? The Bible. And other people work on Islamic law or Hindu philosophy or whatever. And, I read this distinction between religion of the law, religion of the gospel a long time ago in Pieper. And then I was forced to study in depth many religions, and I teach world religions, and I found it was actually true. Yeah, there's a lot to be said about that, but I think not least is understanding not only the uniqueness of Christianity as a proclamation of God's gifts in Christ, and that being a unique thing among the world's religions, but also understanding that the commonality that you might find with someone who practices another religion or no religion at all is always going to be a commonality in or concerning the law. The notion of the revelation of the God of the universe as one who is primarily a father in and for the sake of Jesus Christ is unique. And that is the unique power and content of the gospel.
So I'm curious, this might be a super narrow question, but I've been told at least on 2 different occasions, once by a professor at Concordia St. Louis in a classroom setting, and then I think recently by a classmate of mine on Twitter, that what you just said is not entirely true, because there's this little strand of Buddhists somewhere in Japan or something that teaches basically grace, teaches basically a benevolent, sovereign, saving God. Are you familiar with that argument at all?
Yeah, that is Pure Land Buddhism. That's the English translation, and it is, at least in its origin, it's unique to Japan. It's going to be found anywhere in the Japanese diaspora. So the west coast of the U.S., parts of Brazil also have Pure Land temples, and that particular sect teaches that what you need to do in order to attain salvation. Okay, that's going to be the hinge word here. But in order to attain salvation, you need to call on Amitabha Buddha, who will save you. So that sounds to Christians, especially Protestant Christians, like it's grace. The key term here is that salvation for a Buddhist does not mean rescue from death. It means extinction. It means a release from suffering. So the metaphysics of Buddhism being vastly different from Christianity, where Christianity has in view the essential goodness of creation and the goodness of the world that God has made, which is the motivating factor in his, he's going to do this for the sake of his name, he says several times in Ezekiel, right? Because he made it, he will redeem it. That basic understanding that salvation involves the salvation of God's creatures is so utterly different from the notion that suffering is the primary problem and a release from suffering, which includes a release from the body, the family, the orders of creation that the Bible's telling you are actually good things, means that although the mechanics in Pure Land Buddhism involve my doing nothing, my invocation of a more powerful agent to resolve my problems, it isn't the same at all because it's not dealing with the goodness of creation, which is why Christ can occupy a human body, because human bodies are not in and of themselves evil, whereas anything in Buddhism is going to assume the evil of the visible world.
I think that's really fascinating, because in one sense I can see where their argument kind of holds a little bit, that there is this saving meta narrative or acting God meta narrative. The story hinges on God doing something. And in that way, you could maybe say that's gospel, not law. But it's a really, really wooden view of law and gospel to say that. And what you're kind of arguing, I think, is that part of the gospel is the created order existing, right?
Yeah.
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 Go ahead, respond to that.
Well, and also the agent there is not an utterly gracious agent, right? In Christianity, the agent of salvation, the triune God, is utterly gracious. He is not bound to do any of this, nor has he earned his status. His status exists because he is. So that's a different thing. If someone simply doesn't have to do it at all and could be just fine without doing it, and yet he does it for you anyway, that's very different from any Buddha, because a Buddha a Buddha may be invoked as a god, especially in cultures that were evangelized under what's called the greater vehicle, Mahayana. That's their own term, which is theistic Buddhism. But a Buddha, although treated as a god, depicted in art as a god, a Buddha is someone who has fundamentally attained a status through his or her own efforts. And so that is also different even from what we're saying about Christ's work for us, right? Christ does not earn a status that was not his. He is the eternal Son. Christ takes on the form of a servant and makes himself subject to death freely, not earning it, but putting himself, becoming poor so that in him we might become rich. So it's actually totally different. It's still a religion of the law because Pure Land Buddhism still depends upon some being who is not by nature divine, attaining a divine status in order to be gracious to those who call on him.
Yeah. That's a cool point. How much does the call on this Buddha who will save you have a, for lack of better language, a decision theology component to it?
Well, I mean, yeah, and that is one of the basic issues, is that any religion of the law, whether it is formally inside or outside of Christianity, I think this is a really helpful way to understand not only other religions, but errors within Christian theology. Any religion of the law will attribute far too much to human beings and their capabilities apart from Christ than the religion of the gospel does, right? So Pure Land Buddhism relies on the fact that you will freely want to call on Amitabha Buddha, right? In the same sense that Arminian theology or decision theology is going to rely on my willingness to choose Jesus. There's a billboard. The county I live in is sometimes called the Bible Belt of the Northeast, and there's some truth to that. There is a billboard on Route 30 when you enter into Lancaster County that it says different things at different times. It's all from this one Mennonite church, but every November they put up a version of it that has God voted for you, one hand putting a paper ballot into a ballot box. Will you vote for him? Right. So it relies on that theology relies on my capacity to decide for Jesus. That really, and I don't say this lightly, that really is no different from how pretty much every non-Christian religion thinks about human capacity. They all assume free will before conversion.
Which brings us back to the two religions issue being one that is not limited to Christianity versus non-Christianity,
right,
but is a fight within Christianity. I want to come back to that, but I want to throw one more thought out here.
Sure.
And if you have no connection point to this, that's fine. But I find it really interesting, and maybe this is just an intuitive leap that doesn't really need to go anywhere, but that a particular strain of Buddhism that conceives of salvation as the extinguishing of your life arises in Japan, which I actually really like. Japanese culture. I think it's really interesting. But it also has a dark history, and it reminded me of a book. What you were saying, and this idea reminded me of a book I read as a young man called Shogun by James Clavell.
Yeah,
a very popular book, good book. I mean, it's a good read at least. But I also remember that book being tarnished in my mind by a friend who was very well read, very intelligent guy, who decried it as, and the words he used to decry it was, James Clavell thinks that that Japan is a culture of death, and it's not. Okay, and then he made me read Musashi, which I read, and I just thought it was boring. It's just kind of a boring read. But I find it interesting though, so that that this version of Buddhism that arises in Japan is effectively a cult of death, right? What do you think? Am I tying too many pieces together?
Maybe. I don't know. I haven't read Musashi. I read Clavell when I was in like high school, so I can't remember enough. I mean, I'm like 64 years old now, so that was a while ago. But I guess I would say I'm comfortable saying abstractly that when something is a religion of the law, not only do you have scriptural promises that way is a way to death, right? To sit in the seat of sinners, to walk in the way of scoffers, is a way of death. So that's going to be true of any religion of the law. And the reason for that is that you're trying to conceive of life without Christ. So you may even want things that the Bible would say are good, right? So, a lot of polytheistic religions, for instance, are going to try to perpetuate your earthly life after death, right? This is especially the case in a lot of African traditional religions where the goal is to be reincarnated. So it's very different from like Buddhism in that like you want to be reincarnated in African traditional religion so that you can continue your life as you have it now, optimally into the future. Okay. So that's actually like life is not bad. It's not bad to, may you see your children's children is a scriptural blessing. Like the prolonging life is theoretically a good thing. The issue is that any religion of the law is going to give you a false answer to how anything good has come to you or will come to you because it doesn't know Christ, right? Think about the small catechism here, right? The attributes of God that are identified in the article under creation, right? Why does God do all this? Why has he given me all this stuff? Well, it's out of his fatherly divine goodness and mercy without any merit or worthiness in me. So Luther already picks up the language of merit, worth, all of that in the first article. So then he can show you when he talks about Christ in the second article, how and why that is all the case, right? The reason he is fatherly and good toward me is because of Christ, because Christ has fulfilled his holy will, has propitiated his wrath, made atonement for men, and is risen from the dead because of all of that. So if you don't know Christ, anything that's good that you either have or you want to have, you will try to obtain in a false way. And it's really important to see this as a basic problem for fallen human beings and not to see it merely as a phenomenon of there's Christianity and then there's everything else. That's true, like on paper, right? That's true theologically. There's Christianity, and that's the religion of the gospel, and then there's all the other false religions. But the problem of pursuing the religion of the law is a problem for every human being, even if he is baptized. That is part of his temptation, right? There's more to say about that and people being fundamentally religious, but what do you want to jump in here with?
Well, okay, so I think we can connect what you just said about there being. I want to get back to there's only two religions, and I want to get back to how that is something that takes place within Christianity as well. But the point you're making goes even further, is to recognize that this is something that takes place in your head and heart every day.
Yeah,
right. That even as a Christian, you are still hungry for the religion of death, which is the law. And that is not to say that Christianity doesn't have a place to teach the law, which is good, right? So we want that too. So how do you distinguish that from then putting your trust in the law, which is good? And to quote Ferdy, quoting Luther, that we have this tendency to use the best things of God in the worst possible way, that's always right there with us.
Right. So the law, the place of the law is revealed by Scripture not to be for salvation. The place of the law is within the functioning of creation, which as a Christian, because of Christ, you now understand as God's gift. So instead of seeing, let's say, my job or vocation as a burden, as something miserable that I'm merely fulfilling in order to get richer and someday not have to come to work and see all these stupid people, on Monday morning, I'm now going to see as a gift to me, and that enables things that are very practical and real, like motivation, that enables things like contentment, because I now understand my life, the fact that I'm still breathing, as a gift, right? People usually, I think, get that more when it has almost been taken away from them. Let's say when they've been unemployed for a long time, or they had a real medical problem, the fact that you are there at all becomes much more of a gift when you almost didn't have that, right? So but that means that the law is not then something whereby I assure my status before God, which is usually how we think about the term religion, right? Religion is specifically a human being's relationship to God, the gods, the divine, the spirits, the ancestors, whatever, right? That status in Christianity is assured for me through only the work of Christ for me, right? And that if I can use this word, and this is not kind of a common theological word, so I hope nobody sends angry emails, but that kind of relativizes the place of the law. Whereas the law is a ladder in the religion of the law, it's a way to get up to God. The law is basically, just the optimal functioning instructions for how all of God's gifts are meant to operate. It's not a way to ensure that they exist. Okay. The law tells me how to be a good father to my children. It doesn't tell me how or why the Heavenly Father has made me his child. Right. And it's not that being a good father is irrelevant. It's very important. Right. But it's just not salvation. So I guess what I would say is a religion of the law always takes the law, and instead of seeing it as God's gift for understanding the functioning of his creation, it always turns the law into something that it ought not to be.
The law is who you are according to God. It's who you are created to be. And I like the way you described that, the sort of the functioning operation of life, as opposed to, say, the assembly line of life or the repair shop of life. Right. That's what we kind of want to make it into. Yeah. But it isn't that. It just is life. It is what life is. And we have, in our sin, then rejected that. That's our problem. We don't want what life is.
Right.
And we try to get away from that. And then that leads to death. Right. And I'm going to plug myself here just for half a second. I wrote a book called Echo. If you haven't gotten a copy, I do recommend it. It's one of the best things I've ever done in my life. And the whole first third of it on the 10 Commandments is about this very idea that the law is who you are. And that's what makes it such a good thing. But then it, as you kind of ended there, it has to stay in its place. I feel like this is a Luther quote or apocryphal story maybe about how he described it sort of like a junkyard dog that you got to keep, but you keep him tied in the corner, and he'll bark at you and scare the bejeebies out of you, and that's good. But you got to remember he's got a leash on him too, and he's never getting off that leash because, God's got to hold the leash, and God doesn't want the dog to kill you. So I don't know if that really helps, but I think that it is helpful for me, at least, for distinguishing between law and gospel. The issue is not that we have law or gospel, it's that we distinguish between them as two separate things. Yep. And we have this problem in our hearts of not doing that. We want to fuse them. We want to blend them into the same thing. I want to make the law the way by which I get better or am saved, right? The ladder that you described, which is that's right out of the book too, by the way. That's in the Lord's Prayer section at the end of the book. Is the ladder versus the ship? But we'll leave that for the side. We want to turn it into a tool for proving ourselves to God, and then we want to turn the gospel into a law. We want to use it to try to make people do law more, and we end up watering it down that way, and they fuse. Now, I don't know how much you want to get into Christianity doing this denominationally. I'm not sure that's really super helpful, just to recognize that it's there on paper again. But kind of backdooring our way, maybe toward the text again, because we've been hitting this from the side the whole time. I have a beef with law and gospel as a phrase because of its overuse as jargon to the point of meaninglessness.
Yeah.
I almost never use the phrase, especially in preaching. I mean, once in a while I'll be like, this is a hard bit of law, but I almost never say law and gospel together as a phrase, nor in Bible study. I will teach it in catechism class. I'll be like, this is this is that, right? So I'm not against it, but I don't use the terms because I think the terms, they don't mean anything anymore. And that's a problem. That's a real problem.
Yeah. I would say that when we're saying all this and you're like, okay, well, you might be listening to this and thinking like, how does this apply? outside of Christianity, because we keep saying the law, God's law, is that the structure of how people misuse the law is the same, whether that content is biblical law, right? And they're Christians and they're using the law as a ladder, or they're using the law to, club another sinner instead of attending to the log in their own eye. They're picking out splinters from others. Whatever misuse of the law, whatever abuse of the law they're doing, the structure is going to be the same for a non-Christian religion. It will simply be filled with different content. But the way that sinners use prescription, pride, external markers of being good or bad, all of those things that you can see the Pharisees doing, where they're so close but they're so far at the same time, that's going to be the case in non-Christian religions. You will find them inventing codes. You will find them inventing markers of significance. You can think about different colors and different rituals or auspicious days to do certain things, let's say in Chinese religion. So the way that human beings use what should be filled with the content of God's law, and then they misuse that content or some content they invent, that's going to be similar both within false Christian teaching and openly non-Christian teaching. I think that's important to say, because if you don't grasp that, the line, you're going to think that the line between good and evil runs, somewhere far outside you. And you will have missed the point, which is made both in Scripture about the distinction between law and gospel being an issue of the human heart in 2 Corinthians 3 and 4. And the tendency that you see throughout, especially the major prophets like Ezekiel, for people who are, inside the fold of God's people to invent works for themselves instead of attending to God's law. They'll just make stuff up and then, teaching as commandments the doctrines of men, right? To quote Jesus quoting the Old Testament. The line between the religion of the law and the religion of the gospel, the line between evil and good, runs within each human heart. And once you learn that also changes your attitude both to Christians that are wrong about certain things and non-Christians, because the points of contact multiply once you realize that they have all the same native theological problems that you have. It's just that among the gifts that God has given you is a greater knowledge of himself. And you can operate from that massive gift of knowledge. But I mean, one of the beautiful things about the distinction between law and gospel is that it shows you clearly that, you have nothing that you have not received. The whole thing right along the way has been a gift.
It made me think about a couple of thoughts there, and then I lost the last one. It just kind of fled away. It had to do with individuals that you might run into on the street. Someone who's not a Christian, who is living in this sort of conscience-stricken state. Mm-hmm. But it's not like they're like, "Woe is me, I need salvation."
Right.
That's not it.
Right.
Right. Instead, they're usually it's almost like a brainwashed or a robotic habit of I'm fine, I'm good, I'm fine, I'm doing great, this is all right, I'm doing good. And that's actually, and you hear it not even in the I'm fine, but they're always talking about what they've done that's good.
Yeah, or how busy they are. How busy they are.
Right,
yeah.
right. Yeah. So they're saying words about the value of their life to you, to themselves. And they really don't care about you at all. They want you to affirm what they're saying so that they can feel comfortable with what they're doing, so they can stave off the existential dread that they don't want to believe exists. And they are, again, like a childishly brainwashed state of not believing or seeing that. And this is not only for non-Christians. This is also something that many Christians have not matured in the faith out of. And I don't know, what the answer to that is. And as I say this, it did remind me, though, of the other thought that I'd had, which is how within the parish, I know you've experienced this, we all do, there is a great more deal stress and concern given to traditions of men. Not even like, I'm not saying liturgy.
Right. No.
I'm saying like the things we've decided we got to do to be us.
Yeah.
And I'll just use flowers on the altar as an example. Like that is, it's one of the most fascinating to me because it begins as like, look, someone's getting married, someone's died, there's flowers, let's put them on the altar, it's pretty. But now it's gotten to the point where in most congregations, we have plastic flowers on the altar because no one wants to buy them because they're expensive, but we've got to have flowers on the altar. Otherwise, well, it just isn't pretty anymore. And there's like stress and concern about this, right? And it's like, but how does this even matter in any way, shape, or form, right? So that's just an example of it, that in the church, we will, and by that I mean the congregation, we have a tendency to elevate not the 10 Commandments to our life and structure together.
Right.
And then the 10 Commandments kind of slips away a little bit. One last thought, and then please respond. So Pastor Brian Wolfmueller had said to me at one point, I don't think he ever did this because I'm not sure it's possible, but he was like, I want to develop a church constitution that is structured around the 10 Commandments. It's like, well, that's a novel thought. Huh. What would it look like if we had like a board for helping your neighbor's body, and a board for helping the marriages, and a board for taking care of the property of other people, and a board for, making sure we all speak the truth? Why don't we have that? Right. And I'm not sure you could do it again. I'm not a big fan of boards anyway, but it's a really interesting, again, example of how we think the things that matter are not the things that matter.
Yeah. This is not apocryphal. This is something that actually happened. Is that there was a church. I know the guy that had personal experience with this. There was a church that was declining rapidly in membership. Members were moving away from the neighborhood, and they were having trouble, keeping a pastor. The giving wasn't what it once had been, but there had been so many memorials into the flower fund that they had fresh flowers every Sunday, even as the church, the ministry of the gospel was unsustainable there, and they believed in the divine commandment of the sacrosanct memorial fund, which usually has no legal basis, but they kept funding the fresh flowers even as everything else declined around it, and they closed the church with plenty of money for fresh flowers, but nothing else. And I think that is an example where if the church is not aware that logs also get into the eyes of people who are Lutheran long before they were conceived, so to speak, right? Who are completely Orthodox, who are the two guys on this call. Logs get into everyone's eye, and if you're not adept at seeing that, if you can't see, remember that the prophets are sent to Israel, right? And we talked whenever we started Ezekiel, like 7 years ago or whatever. We talked about how he's not sent to people of a foreign language because God says they would actually listen. It is particularly easy for the Christian to imagine that he is not susceptible to any of these temptations to set up the law or any other idol where it ought not to be. You see it all over the Gospels, you see it all over the prophets, that the church is constantly setting up things as God, which are not God. And it's a fearful thing when he pronounces that he's going to just come knock it all down. Which is what he's going to do to Jerusalem, to the temple, to all of it. But I wanted to get into this idea of religion of the law because I think your description of the average modern American is really helpful. One thing that we're maintaining when we say there's only two religions is that everyone is fundamentally religious. That people's need to explain what they're doing with their time, their need for a sense of meaning in their life, whether or not that's coming from something that it can be identified by the IRS as a 501c3 nonprofit religious organization, doesn't matter. And we're not saying that religion has to do in these terms with some specific set of rituals or a building or what, or organization. We're not even talking about organized religion. We're talking about the beliefs that run people's lives, the reasons that they spend time where they do and think about the things they do and lead their lives the way they do. All of that is covered under the basic term of religion. And we're saying that everyone you meet is religious. You might have to spend a lot more time in a, largely secularized, post-Christian liberal democracy, figuring out in some person's specific case, what is your religion? What is driving you? But eventually you'll get there. Eventually you'll get there. It's just not as clear cut as it was when, say, like tomorrow is the commemoration of Boniface, the apostle to the Germans. And, Boniface could just see the tree and they're worshiping the tree as a representation of Wotan. And he's like, okay, I'm going to chop down this tree. That's how I destroy these idols. It's a lot more hidden generally in a secularized society, but it's not like it's not there. It's not like human beings have suddenly started being born who just have no religious inclinations in their lives whatsoever.
Yeah, there are a few more fundamentally religious people than convinced atheists.
I know.
They're amazingly religious.
They're very evangelistic.
Devout. Yeah, evangelistic and devout. Even in a good kind of pious way at times. And so I want to play with this a little bit because there's a lot of thoughts I have on this too. Because religion, you mentioned earlier, is a word we hear as being kind of about the law. And there is a tendency or a habit among some Christians to want to therefore get rid of the word.
Yeah.
And
right.
I don't think that's very helpful. This all came kind of to a head for me a few years ago when I did a rap video, my only released rap video. In response
I missed
to
that one.
You missed this one. It's the highest viewed video I ever did. And it's because it's in response to this guy named Jefferson Bethke. Okay. Still remember his name. I don't know where he is now. He was up in Seattle, and he had done sort of a spoken word kind of poem rap thing about how Jesus kind of hates religion, right? Okay. But he loves spirituality. And I not only was very frustrated by the video, but I didn't really think his poetry was so hot. So my rap video is entirely off the cuff. I mean, I didn't write a word down. I just sit there and I just rhyme like, freestyle. And it's pretty bad, but it also kind of makes the point, and goes at this idea again that religion is not the problem as a word. And without going too much into what he does, I mean, he ends up basically teaching a legalistic religious view of Christianity by the end of his video. I don't want to chase that too much, but come back to this word religion and how good it is. And at that time, then I did some research into the word religion, trying to find its etymological background, right? Its root, where it came from. That's how I remember words too, by the way, as I learn where it came from, and that it sticks in my head better. And it seems from what I did then that it's a word we don't really know where it came from.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But the best guess that we kind of get to is it just means to repeat something often, right? So anything you would do repeatably is a religious act. And we use the word this way, right? I brush my teeth religiously, right? Every night I brush my teeth. So we use the word this way, which then to me just amplifies that anybody who would say, and I think this goes back to what you were saying, anybody who would say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, is speaking. I mean, they have, it's a code phrase for I have a private religion, not a public religion. It's code phrase for I want to choose what I believe, not agree with anybody else or confess in together. But at the same time, on the surface, it is a nonsensical thing to say. It is utterly meaningless as a phrase to say I'm spiritual but not religious. Because this is your point again, everybody is religious. We just have pegged this idea of religion into certain categories that we maybe attribute to temples, right? The groups that have temples,
right.
As opposed to behaviors. And that's what this distinction between law and gospel and the religion of the law and the religion of the gospel is that there are only two behaviors of the heart in all the world. Right. There is one that seeks its repetition, right, and its life, therefore, in doing stuff, law. And then there is the one that seeks its repetition in life in receiving stuff, from Jesus, right? Gospel. So I threw a bunch there, and I maybe didn't say quite what I wanted to even, but I feel like I should throw it back at you.
Well, I think that when Paul requests that he will have his heart refreshed in Christ, that is getting at something that in his imprisonment is evident to him, which is his legal freedom has been taken away for the sake of the gospel. He has suffered much for the sake of the gospel, because finally the gospel is what grounds his life. That's the basis of who he is and what he does, because he says it's not I who live, it is Christ who lives in me. And that sense of grounding or basis is something that everyone either is looking for and or has. He may not be self-conscious about it. He may not be reflective about it. In fact, my suspicion is that fewer people are reflective than ever before in human history, because we are entertained out of being reflective. We don't even have the silence to be reflective. But anecdotally, when I teach on Indian religion, I try to convey the connection between ethnic group or caste in India and India's religious diversity by inventing these political parties for the students. And I try to make them comfortable by, I always volunteer first. I say, I'm in the Lutheran party. Who else is in the Lutheran party? And, this being Southeastern Pennsylvania, generally nobody is. But they get a, and then some kids will volunteer to be in the Catholic party. That's usually a few, and whatever else. And usually if I offer an atheist party, but lots and lots and lots of the students sign up for the atheist party first. And then I will teach them the term spiritual but not religious, which a lot of them don't know that as a sociological term, but they describe themselves that way. And then the atheist party usually pretty much empties out. There might be one or two kids who are, hardcore, like intellectual dark web kids or something. And they're actually committed to Sam Harris, religiously. And so they stay in the atheist party, but most of the kids fall into spiritual but not religious. And what I think is interesting about that is if I'm evangelizing them, then fine. I'm not going to hold on to the term religion right away. But what's weird is that when they're saying spiritual, I think privatized would be a better word for their religion. Mm-hmm. And you used it because what the elements of their life that they're missing are the elements that people that go to church actually have and don't miss until they can't anymore. So, why do we visit homebound members of a congregation? Part of the reason we do that is because they miss public organized religion, and they know it, and they know why, because they don't get to be there when there's special brass accompaniment at Easter, and they don't get to be there for the potlucks, and they don't get to go through the handshake line and talk to the people next to them and shake the pastor's hand and ask the questions in Bible class and get the coffee refill and smile at the lady that's sitting next to where the coffee is. That they don't, all of that is gone once your religion, it becomes privatized because, medically you're not allowed or you're not able to go to church anymore. It's as if most people in our society, especially anybody who describes himself as spiritual but not religious, has already made himself a homebound member, except he's not really a member of anything and no pastor is coming to visit him. So it's there's something amputated about their spiritual lives. And what I think is cool about that is that they are always interested in the organized stuff. So if I give a lecture, I cover mysticism. I try to cover different kind of generic religious topics, and I'll talk about mysticism in Islam, and that's like a pretty complicated thing, and that has to do with Sufis and everything. But usually people aren't interested in that. But if I show them a video of the Latin Mass, which I do when I teach on Roman Catholicism, everybody's interested. Why are they doing that? What's going on? Why is he holding that up? All this kind of thing. People need organized religion. You don't have to tell them that, and you don't have to use that phrase, but that's what they need, because they're actually they were made to be in communion with Christ, and Christ has a body, which is the church, and that body shares in a communion. They are meant to be there. You don't have to enrage them to start out with by using terms like organized religion or stuff, whatever. You can get there, you can wait, but they are meant to be in the divine service receiving Christ's gifts. That's what they were made for. So they will come to understand that. And I can see even in people who are very far from Christ, intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, I can see their need for those things.
You got me. I loved all of that. You got me thinking. I'm writing it down too about this group of secularists who maybe some of the Lutherans and Catholics and Methodists who would raise their hand in a religious studies course at a secular university would actually fall into these camps more readily. They just can't. They're allowed to culturally recognize themselves as Lutheran or Catholic or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But the secularized America that I described earlier with the sort of the ants marching, to quote Dave Matthews here, unaware of the religions we are participating in as we seek to justify ourselves day by day. It would be interesting to see a study that divided us into those categories instead of like these like inherited religions or church attending religions, and what those would be. And I think evidently in the realm of politics, you see some of this, and definitely in the realm of sports, you see some of this. But what you said about how they long for the organizational stuff, right? So isn't it interesting that the most progressively religious kind of rejectors of church are also really big in like creating movements that have massive organizational power in America. And like Antifa comes directly to mind for me on this, right? This would not be a group filled up with a bunch of, Latin Mass Catholics or Bible believing Methodists. I mean, it's not that. This is a group of people who by and large probably would identify as atheists and or very agnostic and very secular.
Right.
And yet here they are, tremendously organized, wearing clothing that makes it so you can't even tell them apart as individuals, which is actually more fascist than not fascist. So interesting to me. So that's just one other example. So that they are drawn like moths to a flame to these organizations that will tell them who to be and what to do, all in the name of rejecting that. And again, so you're drawn to the sporting event where you're told what to be and what to do, and this is how it's going to, that's fascinating to me. And to see the breakdown in American society on those levels and those terms that'd be a really interesting study. I don't know if that's even possible or what the categories would be, but
yeah, I mean, I think just if you're listening to this, like, you need to start thinking in terms of the people you actually encounter rather than, I mean, abstractly. And I teach this stuff, so I obviously believe it's valuable. It's valuable to abstractly know what's in the Quran or what are the primary Hindu festivals or whatever. But less abstractly, regardless of where you live in the country or if you live outside the United States or whatever, secularization is something that happens to everybody. So when you're thinking about a group, just because someone says I'm Jewish or I'm Hindu, that doesn't mean that person is practicing his religion any more stringently or knows any more about it than somebody who's like a poorly catechized Missouri Synod Lutheran who doesn't go to church anymore. Just because something is not a Christian religion doesn't mean that person necessarily knows more about it. Or just because that person's parents came to America in 1997 doesn't mean that person has some kind of deep, quote, authentic connection to Islam or Hinduism that you don't, because your family came to America in 1810 or something, and you were supposed to be United Church of Christ, but that doesn't mean anything, and you never learned anything anyway. I mean, it's much more helpful when you're evangelizing people, when you're thinking about your own heart, to think about religion of the law versus religion of the gospel and to see people as basically religious than it is to think abstractly about, okay, you're a Hindu, so let me start out by convincing you why monotheism is true. You can get to that, right? You can get to that content. You can tell, the Jewish guy how Christ is the Old Testament Messiah. You can get there. But the primary point of contact that you have with other human beings is the law and the demand for meaning and significance and righteousness that they already have in their minds. and the desire for love and beauty and truthfulness and wholesome relationships that they were created to want. Maybe they don't have them. Maybe they're not even capable of them, even in a, earthly sense. But that's the contact point you already have. You don't have to start with people along the lines of, okay, so I've learned that you're a Methodist, so now let me tell you why X, Y, and Z about the human will that you believe is wrong. You don't have to do that. That's not even where, I mean, people aren't even theologically well informed enough, generally speaking, to do that. So just start where they already are.
Right? They don't know what they say they believe, and then again, so pegging them by the religion they say they belong to as a category doesn't really help. You have to know what their actual religion is,
Right.
which is going to be back to what they do. Right. So, what do you think of this thought? I'm gonna not categorize it. I'm gonna hedge it a little bit on the other side of it to make sure it's not misunderstood. But the idea that whatever you practice is your religion. Now, someone could say, well, then does that mean as a Christian, I'm not supposed to play sports? No, that's not what I'm saying. No. But you would play sports as a Christian who understands sports as an extension of the Ten Commandments in a certain way.
Yeah.
And if you're doing that, then yeah, there's no problem. But this is just it. Whatever you practice, whatever you do with regularity, it is your religion. Yep. There's no distinction between religion and life, is maybe another way to say this. There's nothing you do that you don't do as a Christian. Yep. And if you think that you do, it means that you're not a Christian during that time, at least in terms of your confession and your understanding. Doesn't mean you're out of the faith, but you could be. I don't know, right? The point is, you're not doing it on purpose. You aren't aware of it. That is a damaging thing. Yeah. And this division of faith and life. I mean, that is what secularism has done or tries to do, but it hasn't actually done it. We're all still practicing something. So what is it? And then when you're dealing with this person who says, I'm a Methodist, but actually is a functional atheist or a therapeutic deist or whatever, right? Rather than going straight at the tenets of John Wesley, you find out what it is they're putting their trust in.
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing all the time you think is going to work so well for you, right? Yeah. And then that's where the conversation has to start. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I think what happens to any religion, whether it's true or false, under our political and economic way of doing things here and now, is that it wants to privatize your convictions. So it wants to take what is potentially everything to you, right? Do all things to the glory of God, right? All things. It wants to take that and it wants to, kind of compartmentalize that, put it in a special compartmented time. So you are, specifically kind of involved in Christianity, let's say on Sunday morning between 9 and 10:30. And the rest of your life, ethically, practically, emotionally, doesn't have a whole lot to do with that. You're not really engaged in God's word at other times. That is a successful privatization. And the sketch that I just made is of a person whom I'm presuming goes to church every single week. So privatization of your own religion of Jesus can happen even if you're in church every week, because it's what our regime, I don't say that like in like a civics class sense, but our way of organizing life does. It privatizes everything and it makes it a consumer choice. I mean, it really successfully did this with Christianity. Christianity had generally, throughout its history, made the claim that there was one truth, right? The Reformation is about teaching the truth in the one church that exists, right? And what we've successfully done in America is we've made that a privatized consumer choice. So the fact that I'm a Missouri Synod Lutheran and I believe such and such about the Lord's Supper or predestination, that's fine. You can take your consumer choices. You can take your whatever, your disapproval of my understanding of marriage, and you can find a church that agrees with you. So privatization is let's say like that's the public way that religion functions among us. And I think it's also what makes us so timid in talking about Jesus, because I think we feel like we have to introduce people to something that is just like a random consumer choice. Like I don't currently need a new vehicle. So if someone calls me up in 5 minutes and starts trying to sell me, an F-250, I'm going to be like, I really don't need that. Like I'm completely uninterested in what you're saying. But if you assume that people are actually basically religious and that religion is some version of a religion of the law, you've already got plenty to talk about.
Yeah, it makes me think about shame, right? Shame at some point is your in. And people aren't just gonna be like, you knock on the door, they're gonna be like, "What are you ashamed of?" They're not gonna tell you.
If you,
right,
right, yeah.
So they have to know you and trust you, and then see that you have shame, and then to some extent see what you do with your shame, and how it doesn't destroy you, and where you can leave it. I think this is also. I like this a lot as a concept for, if we're going to call it evangelism, hand in hand with what I think is mandated in the public proclamation of the resurrection of Jesus as a historical fact, that is just something that needs to be shouted everywhere and anywhere, because I think that is sort of like the trumpet call. It wakes people up. And God does that, not us. How does that work? How could that do it? Well, because that's what God does with those words. So, but in terms of, where does the individual Christian on the ground get the chance to do that? I think that comes often on the other side of being under enough grace in your shame to let others see your shame forgiven, and then open up that conversation into how their religion is a religion of shame too, or what they're the way your natural one is, I guess you should say, and that that's maybe where there's a little more open road. Yeah. We do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's not that preaching in public, as they're doing in, say, the book of Acts, is in and of itself wrong. The reason that you have to open up this kind of stuff in what are usually fairly deep personal relationships with other people is simply because that is the space where people will actually talk about their religion, generally speaking. Otherwise, they don't want to, or they don't know how to articulate their convictions about why they're alive, why, say, they didn't actually go through with killing themselves in high school like they thought about, or whatever kind of dark stuff they have. They're not going to just talk about that because they have been conditioned to talk about big things rarely, if ever, right? You get all these like horrible social surveys about, whatever giant percentage of Americans feel that they have nobody significant to talk to about important things in their life, right? So they don't know how to talk about this stuff, and they're not used to talking about it, and they don't think of it as a group phenomenon. They believe that they've been conditioned to believe that they are utterly unique in the world, even when they're totally not. And so they're just not going to talk about this stuff outside relationships. So that's usually the context for discussing the things of the law and the things of the gospel, because that's where people are going to feel comfortable talking about it. The other place they do it, and they do it kind of as passive consumers, but that's fine too, is by reading stuff and listening to stuff from the internet. And is that optimal? Would it be better to be able to talk to people one-on-one? Yes. Would it happen faster if we could evangelize people in giant groups, as has happened throughout most of human history? Yes. But these are just the conditions under which we operate. So that's where we have to be speaking the gospel.
I had a listener in response to my podcast from last week, which was a pretty like kind of open-ended, maybe even vulnerable, just a diatribe on my part. But he wrote me an email, and he said he and his buddies have a phrase, IDHFIHP, which they use as a joke, and it means I don't have friends, I have podcasts. And
yeah,
but he it was a letter saying thank you for putting this out there, because it does give that human connection point, and particularly when your religion is the confession of Augsburg, that that grace alone saves according to Scripture in Christ. It is lonely, right, to find other words that support that. So we don't want to deny that there's some good in that, but I think you're right too. the fragmentation of human civilization is disturbing, and this failure of marriages is so connected to this. There's a whole nother set of topics we could go into there, and I want to try to wrap this up a little bit. We did not talk about Ezekiel directly, but I have an idea for how to amend that next time. What I want to close with here is I'd like a book recommendation from you, but I'm going to kind of prelude it with a question that I'd like your response to as well. So the election for the presidency of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is happening real quick here. Actually, it happens before the convention. The convention's in July. And there are at this point, I think, 3 leading candidates for the position. Mm-hmm. I'm not particularly vested in this race at this time. I definitely have a candidate I would prefer to see continue than, say, the other 2. But I got a lot less compunction about synodical power and politics at the moment, and maybe that's a failing on my part. But on Twitter, a friend of mine had mentioned that he'd read all the interviews that the LCMS Reporter, which is the newspaper that is published officially by the LCMS, it sort of is a little propaganda machine. Whoever's in charge just kind of gets to direct it. But it did a good job of asking questions of all the candidates. And I didn't read it, but my friend did, and he said, everybody, I read all of it, and almost all the questions are pretty much boring. Like it just doesn't really say much. But then there are 2 at the end, and I'm just going to reference the one where the candidates are asked about what are the most important books or book they've ever read. And one of the candidates references a number of evangelical works, recent ones. And the other one references, and I'm not going to remember it now, another evangelical work that maybe is something of a criticism of American culture, but I'm not sure. And then one candidate says Walther's Law and Gospel. And I thought that was interesting. And then there was another response from someone else I don't know who said, isn't that a bit antiquated? And this is somebody who wouldn't dislike the book, but kind of, or I don't think would dislike the book. Yeah. It's going to be a Lutheran pastor someday, or is one. I'm not sure which. So I thought that was interesting too, though. And it's like, well, is it antiquated? What does it say? And I will confess that sitting down and reading Walther, I can't just hand that book to a layperson. I'm sorry. I don't think you lay people are dumb, but I think you only have so much time on your hands. And when I only get 80 pages into it, and I'm like, I can't get through this thing. Then maybe there's got to be a new resource that's just more digestible. What do you think, Book Rec?
Yeah, so I'm going to go even older than Walther.
Good.
Yeah. Okay. Because I think that the issue with Walther is that Walther's living in a completely print saturated culture. And so he can sustain more rhetorically for much longer than people can right now. And that's our problem, but that's just the way it is. A place that I think is very accessible for American Christians. And most people don't read it because I think Luther, honestly, is more of a meme for most Lutherans than an actual theologian whom they read and digest, is The Freedom of a Christian. And I picked that one because it gives you a biblical understanding of freedom rather than an American cultural understanding. And that is massively helpful, I think, in redirecting your thinking. And it does something in reading it that will prepare you for further study of the Bible and theology generally. And that is to take a word that you thought you knew and to rearrange your mind and your heart around how the Bible uses that word. And it changes you. And that is exactly what needs to happen. And it gives you this concept of freedom and opens it up for you in ways that are very scriptural, very based around law and gospel. The Christian is a completely obedient servant of all, and he's a completely free Lord of all. Read it to find out what that paradox even means. But that's where I would go. And I'd go there also because it's brief and it's easily available. And people's attention spans are just awful right now. And there's nothing I can do about that. So we have to be brief, and we have to do podcasts. It would be great if everybody could digest 400-page books, but we're not there right now. It's not 1870 anymore. to my chagrin, right? To my chagrin. But yeah, that's where I'd go. I mean, I would say, just in defense of it, and I didn't read those interviews, but Walther's Law and Gospel did change my life. Full stop.
Yeah.
I read it when I was becoming a Lutheran, and I just thought it was amazing, right? Wow, this explains what's happening in the Bible. This explains how God is and how God operates. I have seen Law and Gospel, as you were mentioning earlier, abused wildly and horribly since then, right? To the point where, yes, I don't use the phrase Law and Gospel, generally speaking, but that book changed my life.
It changed mine as well, but not because I read the book. One of the first books I stumbled on, I think, so this is when I went to Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. We get there in the summer, but like 3 days or 5 days too late for me to enroll in summer Greek. So I have like the whole summer with all these other guys that are taking Greek before I actually have to go to class. I get a job at the library, and I just kind of putz around and enjoyed life as a kid. But there was like a place where you could pick up, cast aside books down by the mailroom. And I had picked up, I think that's where I got this. And it's a little book called God's Yes and God's No, which is an abridged version of Law and Gospel that basically removes all of his winding, tangential, very specific, very dated against actual people arguments that are put into the book. So that's what makes it so verbose as a work, is that he's just kind of chasing lots and lots of different direct things. And then this book kind of boils it down to the nitty gritty. And that one, I mean, it blew my mind. I was just like, oh, this is incredible. Right. And the same summer, by the way, I also discover Issues, etc. So like 3 months before I go to seminary, I'm reading Law and Gospel kind of, and letting Todd Wilkin catechize me. Really, it was providential, I would say, for myself and my own development. But I'm going to have to, I've never read Freedom of the Christian. I know of it. I've been taught what's in it, but I will have to see if I can get a hold of that at some point. And I will put that in the show notes as well. Pastor Adam Koontz, I really appreciate it. I love these conversations. I really do. And I love, I'm not trying to blow smoke. I love that Darth Vader goes to Ben Kenobi and says, you were once the teacher, but now I am the master. And every time I converse with you, that's how I feel. I'm Ben Kenobi. And it's not that you're Darth Vader, right? But you, it's such a joy to have watched you bloom from that young man who was hungry and zealous and hyper intelligent to the point where now that's been put to work so that you can just teach me. I really, it's a joy for me. And so I want to say that publicly. And it's not blowing smoke. I'm not just trying to make you feel good. It's, I love learning from you. I had one more thing I was going to say when I close, but I don't remember what it is. There'll be a bunch of links in the show notes, and we will be back soon enough. And I think I have a plan for Ezekiel. Maybe.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah?
We'll see.
We'll see on the other side.
Was that worth $1? What about $5? Click the Patreon link in the show notes to sign up. Pretty please?